the Adirondack Museum, and it might not come as any surprise that most of the images in my presentation tonight come from my great collections here at the museum, including this painting here, which was made by Eliphalet Terry, who was a buddy of Winslow Homer, in 1857, and it's called Baker's Farm. And this is kind of what farms, the sort of reputation that farms had at the time, Adirondack farms. Basically, the region had a very poor reputation as a place to go and be a farmer. Bill Terry, the great Adirondack historian, in his book Contested Terrain, gives us an interesting perspective on this poor reputation of the Adirondacks, saying that the people who, from the cities, who had the idea that this would be a great central park for the world, a wonderful area to recreate up here, were happy to downplay the importance of farming up here in the Adirondacks, because they would rather it stay the wild wilderness and not have people cutting down trees and planting potatoes and rye in amongst the stumps. This story about how the Adirondack region was a very poor farmland was easy to believe, because remember the context here. Whoops, sorry about that. Yep, the context is what's going on down in the rest of New York. The big picture on the left here, on the right is the one we just saw, is the farm of a family called Brinkerhoff in the town of Owasco, which is down in the Finger Lakes. And that is what was going on in the rest of the country. People who, well, certainly in the rest of New York, people who wanted to leave New England, the poor rocky farms of New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, and the crowded farms of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and go west, could have a place like this, if they had enough money. And after 1825, of course, even if they didn't have so much money to buy a great farm in central New York, they could head out to Ohio and Indiana. Much, much better farmland and climate there. So the question is, why would anybody come to farm here in the Adirondacks? Somebody who would have to set up their family in a home like the picture on the right, and that is another picture of the Baker's farmhouse. And on the left here is a picture of a farm right about the same time, the 1850s, again in central New York. So if you're talking to your wife about where she wants to set up housekeeping, which one is she going to pick? And of course, it's those wonderful houses like we see on the left there that have been maintained and you can still see in the area. But there was a reason, and it was money primarily. At least according to Livonia Stanton Emerson, who should have known, she came with her family to the Long Lake area in the 1850s. And she wrote a wonderful memoir about growing up there later when she was married to one of the Emersons. And she wrote, "You may ask why a man would move into such a place with a family. The only reason I know was this. Land was cheap, wood was plenty, all it cost to cut it was to cut it. Fish, venison, and fur were plenty. That was quite an inducement to a poor man." So you could come up here and basically just squat in the Adirondacks and make a living. And I think also that I haven't seen this in writing anywhere, but I like to think of the old story about Daniel Boone, and somebody asked him why he kept moving west, and he said he wanted to be somewhere where you couldn't see the smoke from his neighbor's cabin. I think there was something of that in the Adirondacks too, because you certainly were getting away from it all, and although you couldn't really count on ever getting to see your friends and family back in Vermont and New Hampshire, there was more of a possibility than if you moved out to Indiana. But there was farming in the Adirondacks. This is actually in the neighborhood of Tucker Farms in the town of North Elba. And I think what we're doing here is, farmers might be able to tell me, it's either rye or oats, I think. And this was a photograph taken by Seneca Ray Stoddard. And I'll let the real farmers talk about the climate here and the soil and what grows here. Because I would like to talk about a couple of other advantages to farming here in the Adirondacks that don't, I think, always get thought about. At the time, of course, this context of people farming in central New York and places like that was to support your family and grow food for your family, but also there needed to be a market component to it to be really considered a prosperous farm. In much of upstate New York, it was dairy farming. But there were also other wheat farming, of course, in the Genesee country. And that was a real problem up here in the Adirondacks. You could sell a little bit of this rye and oats to your neighbors, but the transportation was so poor that it was really hard to get anything out to the markets. There was a little bit of, well, here's a photograph of a fellow in their old forge with a potato hook and growing things in the back garden for himself. But there was a little bit of commercial farming. One good example is hops. There was quite a craze for hop growing in New York, and you hear a lot of it down in Madison County. But up here in northern Franklin County as well, there was commercial hop growing, and it was a good part-time job for women and children to earn a little bit of money during the season, and that's what's going on here. And there were also great local markets associated with the tourist industry. And a wonderful example of that is the Childwold Park Hotel that was opened in 1890 between what is now Tupper Lake and points north, Colton. And this was actually set up by a fellow named Addison Child, who came in and bought the land there before with the intent of building a hotel. But then he advertised for settlers to come in and grow crops, mostly vegetables, to use in his hotel. So that was a market right there that the settlers at Childwold had. So that was a good thing for them. And you see the great hotels all around the Adirondacks bought local back in those days, again, because it was hard to get, inexpensive to get food in from elsewhere. And we really need to always remember the importance of transportation to commercial farming in the Adirondacks, or why there wasn't commercial farming in the Adirondacks to any great extent. And it went on for a long time. This is a photograph taken, and the postcard are both from the teens. But right up until about 1929, there wasn't even a decent road between Racket Lake and Long Lake. And the way you got there, if you were driving a car like this 1910 Hudson here, is you drove to Racket Lake Village, and you put your car, and I guess your heifer, if you had one, on a little barge like this, and a steamer pushed it up to what is now the Forked Lake Carry, and then you got on what was known as the Carthage Road, is now North Point Road, where I live, and went on north through Long Lake. So the roads were pretty poor, pretty late up here, and a real discouragement to a lot of trucking in the area. The Brinkerhoffs and others in upstate New York had canals, of course, and they also had trains. And there was a little bit of that to bring stuff in and out here in the Adirondacks. This is the Grass River Railroad, which was one of the later lines. Of course, the first line was into the North Creek area in the 1870s, and then the Adirondack Railroad went right through from Utica to Malone in 1892. But then other branch railroads broke off. And this one here I'd like to show a picture of, because here at the museum we have a fabulous set of 44 years of diaries from a woman called Lucilia Clark, who lived near Cranberry Lake. And in 1910, when the Grass River Railroad went through kind of at the bottom of her property there, she switched from making butter to just putting her milk in cans from her 4 cows and sending it out to the Emporium store in Cranberry Lake, because she could put it on the train here. But I think really what made life here not only tolerable, but actually pretty good, when you think of farming, was the mixed lifestyle that people here had. We've all heard about how Adirondackers then and now need to have more than one job to make a living. But they had to have more than one way of conducting agriculture as well. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about, is this sort of farming the woods. Sweepings are a good example of what Adirondackers could get for free. Think of those poor men again, out there in the woods. This is a beekeeper, of course, with a bunch of manufactured hives. But very often, Adirondackers would just follow a beeline, find a bee and follow his beeline out into the hollow log or whatever it was where the hive was, and break it open and take the honey. But sometimes they also took some of the bees and brought them back to put them in a commercial hive, so it would be a little bit closer to home, so they could get the honey out. And of course, everybody knows about maple syrup, which the season is rapidly on us if it hasn't already started. First of all, just people just went out and tapped in the woods. That's what's going on here in Keene Valley, and they just keep pouring sap into that big kettle until it gets poured down. Very different from our evaporator that takes it off along the way. Then structures, they started making semi-permanent structures like this one here near North River, and building a little stone or brick arch and boiling off in there. And there was actually a little bit of commercial work. Most people just boiled the sap all the way down to sugar, and that was their sweetening. And of course it was free, again, which is a very important thing to them. But also, something I read about that I think is kind of interesting is it also helped them feel a little bit more righteous, perhaps, if they were abolitionists. Because there was quite a move to protest slavery by not using white sugar that was, of course, produced by slaves mostly in the Caribbean. So if you were a Wesleyan, which broke off from the main Methodist branch over this issue, you could have maple sugar and feel good about not supporting slavery. I mentioned there was a little bit of commercial sugaring going on. The biggest and operation, which was pretty much unique, was that of a Lowe on the area which is now Lowe's Lake. He had an enormous business making maple sugar there with 3 huge sugar houses. He invented the graduated evaporator. And he also, like his more humble neighbors, made vinegar out of maple sap. You could boil it partway down and then just sort of let it sit out, and it'll get colonized by wild yeast, and after a while you have vinegar. And this again, another free thing, just for the asking and just for the work out of the woods for people who lived here. Berries, too. The amount of berries that some of these families whose diaries and letters I've read is truly astounding. They were getting blackberries, huckleberries, raspberries, blueberries, cranberries, black cherries, elderberries, and a lot of these, like raspberries and blackberries, are crops that, well, I call them crops, but plants that grow up when there's been logging going on, which of course there was a lot more of in the 19th century than there is today. So the Clarks, for example, lived not exactly so much on logging ground, but on the swath that was flattened by the Great Hurricane, the Great Windfall of 1845. And there had been fires after that. So even in 1880, when the Clarks moved to the Windfall, there were these big open sandy plains where they could go and have this great bonanza of berries. In 1865, Julia Baker Kellogg, who's another woman whose diaries we have here at the museum, living near Minerva on what became the North Woods Club. And in fact, that picture I showed at the beginning was her house. Picked 110 quarts of huckleberries, mostly by herself. In 1885, she picked 30 quarts of strawberries. Strawberries. And in 1904, my friend Lucelia Clark and a group of guests came home with 100 quarts of blueberries. So the picking was good. And that got a little bit commercial as well. Some people came down on the railroad line to places like Mountain View from the north, from Malone and areas like that, just for the day to go out picking in the area near the railroad station and then go home. And I wanted to mention too that this is another thing that continued up almost to the present day. A century after Julia Baker Kellogg was picking berries, a woman named Marilyn Hathaway, who was a school student in Elizabethtown, and when she went off to the high school, wanted some new clothes. And that summer, 1943, she earned $100 going right through the season, first picking strawberries, then raspberries, then blackberries, and then blueberries, and selling them all in Elizabethtown. She bought all her new clothing for high school, including a winter coat, and had spending money for the rest of the year. One of the things that it must have been pretty dreary about eating in the Adirondacks, because your farm was greens. Your farm could not produce lettuce and things like that for carrying through the winter, obviously, and cabbage was about it. So when summer came along, when spring came along, and little green things started poking up through the ground, it must have been quite a thrill. This is a photograph from the Clark photo album from about 1910. And it's a little fuzzy, but I love the inscription. It says, Miss Wall with a basket of greens. Now, I don't know who Miss Wall was. I think she was either a guest or the local school teacher. But there she is with fresh greens out there in an early spring day. And the question is, what were they? This is another picture taken by Seneca Ray Stoddard of his wife. And I think what she's got there, I think this is a spring day, although it looks like dried leaves in the fall, but what would she be doing creating dried leaves for? I think she's been out picking greens on an early spring day. And what these might have been is Daisy Allen, who was a preacher and an early settler in Baker's Mills, grew up there during the Depression. And she wrote about picking dandelions, as well as pigweed, red root, red dock, cowslips, and something she just wrote was the little onion type part of the cattail. So all of these things are foraging. Now, when I got to working on the cookbook, which is available in the museum store, by the way, with Chef Stephen Topper, who grew up in the southern Adirondacks and is quite a forager himself, he wrote some recipes in there using things like ramps and hen of the woods, chicken of the woods, mushrooms, and things like that, which seem to be pretty familiar among foragers in the area today, but I didn't come across any references to mushrooms or ramps in the material I looked at, which was admittedly pretty scarce. So maybe people, Adirondackers, before this modern age of finding out what's available through a much wider world, was available. I also count apples in this things that you can get for almost free, because apple trees last and last and last. Even today, if you go out into the woods, you can find apple trees still bearing a little bit, along with lilac bushes and daylilies, of course. And so this was something that could have been planted by a previous settler and still stay there, and were very important to Adirondack settlers. Apples can be stored in a barrel in the root cellar. You can dry them, which is what's going on here. This is old Mountain Phelps at home, according to Seneca Ray Stoddard. The thing I liked about the picture is Mrs. Phelps is sitting there peeling and coring and slicing apples, which she's then hanging up in front of that dark blanket in back so that they'll dry. Work made easy by her husband reading her the newspaper. And also, cider making. Julia Baker Kellogg, way back in the 1880s, reported taking her barrel of apples to the local cider mill, which was probably either Minerva or Chestertown, and then going back a week later, and she'd get her cider and get a barrel of cider that would go down to the cellar and last her the winter, and by the end of it, probably be a little fizzy. My favorite crop, sort of serendipitous crop that I'll end up with, is fungus. I like to think of Adirondack women and Adirondack bakers as being fungus farmers. Now, this is a photograph taken by the McCormick Studio in Tupper Lake of a lumber camp. And you all see this fellow here on the far right, sitting on the right. Is anybody, can you tell me what it's kind of a fuzzy photograph, but what does he have on his knees there? No?
Puffball.
Not a puffball. It's something he made. Look, he's got an apron on. A loaf of bread, yeah. I think this is great because these guys are all there with their tools, whatever makes them important in the camp, and he's got bread, which was a very, very important thing to provide to a lumber camp. But think about how he made that bread. This is dry yeast was probably available by this time. It was introduced in the 1870s, or cake yeast rather. But that had to be kept cool, and that had to be kept alive. Probably what he was doing, which was what I think most of the housewives in the Adirondacks were doing right up until the turn of the century at least, was keeping a culture of yeast growing. And you're probably all familiar with sourdough, if you break or even know the concept of it. But this was not sourdough. When you keep a culture of yeast going in a moist medium, bad guys are going to move in and colonize the bacteria that you don't want. In a sourdough culture, the reason it's sour is that a good bacteria has moved in and is living along with the yeast, which is a single-celled organism, single-celled fungus, and that's a lactobacillus culture, and that's creating acid, which keeps the bad guys out. But the New England people didn't really like sourdough that much. They didn't like the taste. And what they did was something different. They kept their culture inoculated against the bad bacteria by using hops. And that is another thing that you can find at old home sites in the Adirondacks. There's a home site I know in Newcomb that has been not lived in for over 100 years, and there are still hop vines crawling through the trees and through the bushes. And they may have been used for beer, probably, but also I'm sure that those hops were important even to the Methodist ladies for using to preserve their fungus, their yeast, so they could continue to make bread. So, don't let anybody tell you, like Samuel H. Hammond or Joel Tyler Headley tried to tell people in the 19th century, that there's no farming in the Adirondacks. And of course, we'll hear more about that now. But the question of whether the region is ever going to look like this again, I don't know. This is the bottom of the Blue Mountain Hill, where we are right now, looking across to the Blue Ridge. And you can see that there, photographs of the region at that time had a lot more open space because people were farming there. But it seems to me that what really made farming viable in a century ago, and maybe even just 60 years ago, was this use of the agriculture that you could get in the wood. Oh, thank you.
I'm Stephen Kramer. All right. You and I will finish you off. That's politics. Thank you very much for coming and being invited. Come and talk. The Miner Institute is in Shazy, so we're just slightly out of the line. But I think the discussion I'm going to give you will show you some of the insight of Mr. Miner and up to current things that we're doing today.
A little louder, please.
A little louder? How's that? Okay. Squeeze in. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of history who Mr. Miner was. He's a center with his wife Alice. He started in the early 1900s what's now started off as the Hearts of Light Farm, which I'll go through, and is now really formally the Miner Institute. His goal really has always been to look at efficiency and production of food. And he's pictured here with his crops and dairy manager. Oops, going the right way. So just to hear about his history and sort of how he came to be. He was born in Wisconsin. His father was a Shazy native, so that's the local Thai. He was orphaned as a young man and sent to spend time on his Uncle John's farm, which is currently where the Miner Institute is. At 18, a brash young man, he went off and really made his life's history in the railroad. One of the things he did is he moved through a shop apprentice and draftsman and estimator. He's very interested in how railroad cars, which, as we talked about before, move products around, and also how the riggings or the connections between the cars could improve stability. So in 1891, he received his first patent for these kind of shock absorbers. They're called a draft rigging, which is up in the top corner. And one of the ideas is that it would prevent cars from slamming together, which would prevent commodities like fruits and eggs and things from being destroyed. Obviously, you get more of your product to the end. Received his first order in 1894, and from then on, very quickly, almost every railroad car in the United States had one of these draft gears. After he married his wife and became a millionaire at age 41, he basically decided what he was going to do is go back to what he felt was his heart's delight, which was this farm in Shazy where he'd spent time as a youth. So he started with really 144 acres and very quickly owned most of the land in the region, around 15,000 acres. It's quite large. So I want to just give you a second to read this because I think it's really important. This is over a century ago. He realized as the human race was growing, and now it's 7.3 billion and growing further, that really our key to success as a people was going to be able to not only produce enough food, but be able to do it in such a manner that we weren't destroying the environment, particularly conservation of soil. So as we see pictures in the past, older styles, mostly horses, always lots of people in pictures, which nowadays has been improved, or changed, so that we have to produce more production off really the same amount of land or more. This is always pushing the yield forward, including how much fertilizers and things we use. So as a goal, the Miner Institute tries to maintain the tradition of excellence in education and research, which really includes demonstration, research, and education as a whole. The farm that was Mr. Miner had conceptualized and built is still on the same property, and the staff is still really hard at work trying to balance these agricultural efficiencies with also maintaining environmental outcomes. We do that by research and activities on the farm, which is open to the public and anyone can come and visit at any time. And also at the Burke Educational Resource Center. This is our field of dreams in the back here, in case you guys wondered. Shoeless Joe doesn't show up in there. So agriculture education is one of the keys that we do. It's basically year-round. We're a 501c3 or a private non-for-profit. So in the spring of the year, which is now, we have an advanced dairy management program. This is typically a 2+2 program for students at a technical college in Vermont that are going to go to UVM. They take a semester with us where they learn more hands-on and practical. That's a great deal of what we try to do. Summer classes are further from that. These are usually younger students that are going to either return to the farm, or in the case of equine management, they're carrying on with their equine studies. Most of these activities involve showing at local fairs or other activities. Fall of the year is the program that I'm most involved with. My background is the Applied Environmental Science program. I'll just go through a little bit of this. The program was really started by Miner in 1972. It was called Man in the Environment. So before SUNY Plattsburgh really had anything off the ground, this is where it started. It's a suite of classes that uses our on-site activities to really prepare people for careers or graduate programs. They're full-day classes versus 50-minute blocks, which gives us more time to integrate and always include hands-on learning. They can use our labs, barns, fields, watersheds. All of the above are incorporated in this. So just to give you a little bit of flavor, a couple of classes that we run, this is the class that I'm involved with. It's called Agriculture and Environment. It seemed like a logical marriage between some of the activities we do on the farm and some of the environmental programs we have. So we teach students with almost no agricultural background, which is basically most of us. In the United States, probably less than 2% of us are making the food for all 98% of us. So we really thought it was important to have some kind of course that actually showed people modern farming, dairy, fruit, or other activities, with environmental regulations considerations, including cropping, fertility, how we manage weeds and pests, and a lot of things that crop up in how we produce our food. Soil science class is also something that's integral, obviously, because you really grow your animals and your feed out of the ground. So we have several activities where we can use certain areas of our property, including making biochar, which is a phosphorus amendment, and really considering how nutrients cycle and move on the farm. I'm going to push this button and see what happens. You know what, I'm going to move on because that's going to give us trouble. Always know when to say no and move on. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the research. As Michaela mentioned, we have a large USDA grant, which is over 6 years. It's the only one in New York State, which is this edge of farm type setup. And really the goal of this is to consider how we collect all surface and subsurface, or what Mr. Miner in the day would call tile drainage. In the early 1900s, Miner used to have this argument with his crops manager on how to drain these heavy-duty clay soils that we always have around here. They're very difficult to get the water off of, so we always envisioned these series of pipes that would go underground that would allow water to be siphoned off and allow you to get on the fields earlier and also grow longer day crops. So this idea that over time, that nowadays we can actually use water control structures to artificially raise or lower water control systems, so we can actually simulate drained or non-drained conditions. So we have this test site, which is this field here, which is north of Chazy off of Route 9. In general, what we have is we have two large parcels of land, which is sort of unique in a lot of the research that people are doing. Most things are done on a very small scale. So what we're doing on this 5-acre parcel of land is we're actually collecting all the runoff that runs off the surface. And in this manhole system over here, which I'll show you a little bit more about, we collect all the subsurface runoff. Same thing on this 9-acre land. The 5-acre parcel will actually be able to run crop and manure like we normally do, but we're able to raise or lower the water table to simulate whether or not this was drained or undrained. So to give you some idea on how this is all done, through the art of some really good people at Soil Water Conservation Districts, we figure out how to process all these things and end up with all of our water coming through from the bottom of a 7-foot manhole. And these devices, which I'm going to go through in a minute here and show you guys, it allows us to collect all the water, find out how much water goes past it and the chemical components of it. So, as in Mr. Miner's day, if you don't have it and no one has it on the market, you build your own. We created this device, which is basically a 2-stage flow material, which will allow us to collect the water coming out of these fields, but also gauge it so as the height goes up and down inside this structure. We have a formula that I'll show you folks in a minute that will allow us to determine how much flow comes out over time. So we're continuously monitoring it versus spot monitoring. We started off by calibrating these things before we installed them in the field. This is one of our graduate students who's doing some measurements on sort of time to fill, so putting a bucket under that spout, figuring out how much time it takes to fill it. So we have a flow rate. We're using a trash pump, which is back behind us from the river, so we can continuously flow this through, increase or lower the rates, and basically develop what they call a rating curve. The idea in all of this is that ultimately the research, we don't want to be standing out there 24 hours a day or having the graduate student. They tend to balk after a while and want to go home. So what we're trying to do is replace some of that things as modern technologies come along by having equipment do some of this for us. This gives you just some idea of the dots being the actual observed standing out there, and this is the actual equipment fitting the line, so it's fairly good over time. What it allows us to do, as I mentioned, is it allows us to make a relationship between pressure or water height and water flow. So again, over time, If we can measure successfully the water height in those barrels, it will tell us how much flow is coming out of that, and that will allow us to gauge this over time. So this is how we all do it. This has been one of my challenges. If you've ever been in a manhole, they're 4 feet wide. There's not a lot of shoulder room. So what we had to do is get all of this equipment in here, and through sheer luck, I won't take any brilliance for it, also make the equipment that's really expensive high enough off the water table that in case it backfloods, you don't lose all of your equipment. Effectively, here's our barrel that's down here in the bottom, where water flow is coming out and through and down to a drain. This little device here is an ultrasonic sensor, which effectively tells us the water height over time. The cable comes around to this device over here, which is called a flow module, which actually converts that into flow and tells the auto sampler here when to sample. All of this is actually housed inside. And one of the things that we're working with literally right now is it gets cold in the winter. Water systems freeze. It makes it a lot harder to measure these systems. But we know over time that a lot of these transition periods between late fall and even that thaw and early winter are some of these times where nutrient pulses are really big. So we need to do our best to try and capture these things. This just gives you a little bit of an example, and I'll walk through the couple of graphs here comparing what runs through the surface and what runs through the subsurface on the same thing. The red line at the top is total nitrogen. The standard limit for water quality is around 10. So this shows this is fairly high. This is mostly composed of nitrate and ammonia. And for those of you who don't know, plants don't have teeth, so plants need to take up minerals in forms that they can. So nitrate and ammonia are the most common forms. This is the same type of graph. This shows us what comes through the underground section. So we were discussing this earlier, how last year it was very, very dry. So this shows us that over time, we have this huge pulse that comes through the soil system, filters down to the subsurface system, and eventually exits over time. Same story is more or less true with phosphorus, which is one of the nutrients of concern, especially with eutrophication in Lake Champlain. This graph shows us that we have these huge pulses. These are really off the chart in terms of 5,000 or 6,000. This is what's running over the surface. And this is the same type of graphs that are showing us what's coming through the subsurface. So in general, what we're seeing is there's a lot less phosphorus that runs through that subsurface, but more runs over the surface. So some of the implications might be as time goes by, more and more farmers are tiling their land. You double the yield, you get the water off quicker, it's kind of a no-brainer. Really what we're looking at is where's rubber meeting the road? How do we figure out what's the best way to manage these systems so that we can farm from now and into the future? So these are some of the things that we're working on as our next phases. We're going to actually figure out the total amount that's lost. So rather than just looking at concentration values, we can actually figure out pounds per time that are lost, so we can find the best way to examine differences with different crops over time and work on the best management solutions. As I mentioned before, the Institute is open to the public. So if any of you would like to come and visit, we'd be grateful. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. Michaela, I got here a little early this morning, or this afternoon, and Michaela said there'd be 30, 35 people here. Because there's some sort of ball game going on today. And winter hasn't gotten here, so there's no reason to have cabin fever. So I don't know why you're here. I'm Steve Tucker from Tucker Farms, which is fairly close by. It's in Gabriel's, New York. I'm the 5th generation. My nephew, Ben, possibly the 6th generation. We're working on them. We started the farm in 1864. I don't remember the beginning of it myself, but from what we've gathered, my great-great-great-uncle worked for Paul Smith when he was building his hotel in Paul Smith's, New York, which is now Paul Smith College. He built a hotel on the St. Rita's River, and he dammed it up so it'd be on a lake, and so he could get power. And he tried to grow crops for his guests and his guides, and because the soil up there is so sandy, he had crop failures for a while. So my great-great-great-uncle either got volunteered or he volunteered to be the supplier of food for him. And our farm is in Gabriel's, which is only 5 miles from Paul Smith's. So that was the beginning of our venture into farming, and for some reason or other, we're still doing it. So he was growing a variety of different vegetables, and on the St. Regis Lakes, there's 64 camps And right now, there's like 15 of them that are road accessible. So Benjamin Hobart had bought a boat so he could deliver directly to the camps, instead of just having Paul Smith College or Paul Smith's Hotel as his customer. He was picking up some of the wealthy camps on the lake. And then when the hotel went out of business, he still had the camps, and around 1921, the New York State Potato Seed Group organization was organized, and he was one of the founding members. 90% of the seed potatoes grown in New York State at that time were grown in Franklin County, New York. So they got together and formed a seed growers cooperative, which we're still a member of. Now there's only 6 seed growers in New York. But 20 years ago there was 36, so they're dropping. So we were growing vegetables when the Hobarts were running it, and grains, slides of grains. We grow rye, barley, buckwheat, and oats. Some we harvest for grain, and some we use for cover crops, because we're on a 3-year rotation with our potatoes now. And the grains don't take as much nutrients out of the soil as potatoes, so it takes a couple years to build the soil back up with the different grains that we're growing. And we quit growing vegetables after Frank Hobart died, my great uncle. My father and my uncle were running the farm. The price of labor went up, and it got expensive to keep the weeds and stuff out of the vegetables, so we were concentrating on potatoes and grains. And the price of potatoes didn't go up for a long time, so when I started taking over the farm, I went to a couple of restaurants to see if they would like potato or the vegetables, and they all wanted fresh vegetables. What they were getting off the, I can't say Cisco truck, food conveyor trucks, they had been on truck for at least a week, so the restaurants I stopped to wanted fresh vegetables. And this is like 15 years ago, so I was ahead of the buy local curve. So I was the first one in the area going to the restaurants with fresh vegetables. So that's how we got into that. And we now have a corn maze that runs in August, September, and October. So that's something else that keeps us busy and out of the police blotter. So that's some of the things that we've diversified into. We're back into growing vegetables in the corn maze. And in the last few years, we've had weddings at our farm. We have them at the corn maze because there's a big field there that you can have pictures at, and set up a big tent and have the service and reception there. So as times change, you have to evolve and change with the times. Because if we were still doing the same old thing, we wouldn't be doing the same old thing, because we could be out of business. So I think for farmers, you've got to be able to adapt and change as the times are changing. So that's how we're still in business in the Adirondacks as a farm.